Now, microbes, when we talk about condition monitoring, really the bottom line with that is that we want to use condition monitoring to make sure we don't have a microbial problem. And that's because we know microbial presence is linked to a whole bunch of bad stuff. And microbes, however, they often go undetected for long periods of time because of incorrect sampling, incorrect testing, or a combination of the two, which is even better. You've got bad sampling, you've got bad testing, or we could have both, you know? Of the two, sampling versus testing, incorrect sampling is probably the greater problem out of the two. Now, detecting microbial contamination always starts with sampling. Now, people always assume, and this is an important couple of points to understand. People always assume that when they're doing a test, they select a test because they think it's going to tell them something they need to know. People always assume that whatever test they choose is going to tell them what they want to know. And as such, they assume that their sampling, whatever sampling things are going to do, they always assume that their sampling methods produce accurate representations of the actual conditions going on in their storage tank. Now remember, way back at the beginning, we said something like where and how you sample controls what you detect. Now, let's take an example of that. The most common place, say you're at a gas station, the most common place that people collect fuel samples from is where? Give you a couple seconds. Okay, the most common place that fuel samples are collected from is from the dispensers. Now, why is that? Well, they're convenient. It's easy to get a sample from that. It's also fast. You don't really have to do any work. The dispenser's there, boom, you can get whatever sample you want. It's fast and it's easy, and it gives us a fuel sample that is perfect for fuel quality sampling. But there's a distinction here. It's perfect for fuel quality sampling or samples that are going to be used in fuel quality testing. But it's not perfect for microbiological testing, and there's a difference between the two. Basically, what it comes down to is that fuel samples that are good for, let's call it fuel specification testing, are bad for microbiological testing and vice versa. If you're relying on a dispenser sample to test for microbes, you are probably not going to have a very representative sample at all. In order to detect microbes, when you're talking about the kind of sample you need to have, in order to detect microbes from your sample, you cannot get it from the dispenser. You need to take a bottom sample from the tank itself. But even if you get a good bottom sample, or what you think is a good bottom sample, even if you get that, it's still remarkably easy to get a bad bottom sample that's not going to tell you what you need to know about your microbial condition. Now, the tank itself, we say, well, why is that? Well, unfortunately, the tank itself can have a lot to do with this unfortunate fact. It is not uncommon to have a storage tank that has zero detectable free water, when they stick the tank, or when they try to pull a sample and see if there's any water. It's not uncommon to try and get a sample and say, hey, we don't have any water in this tank. Meanwhile, there's actually 55 gallons plus of water. Why is that? Well, you might have pulled the sample at the fill end, and maybe the tank isn't level. That's a big thing. If the tank is a little bit unlevel, and the turbine end, which is the other end, the end that usually does not have a place to pull samples from, an opening, you could have zero detectable free water at the fill end where you have access, and have 55, 60, 100 gallons of water all the way down at the other end where you don't have access to. Now, for underground storage tanks, there are regulations that talk about the level, the levelness, I guess, lack of better way to put it, the levelness of the tank. Tanks are the regulations dictate that when you're putting a UST in, it's supposed to be what they call, the term they use is trim by the fill end. What that means is that the tank is either supposed to be level or just slightly lower on the fill end. Now, if the fill end's a little bit lower, then any water that develops is going to roll down to and collect at the fill end, where you typically have a way to get it out. So the regulations dictate underground storage tanks should be trim by the fill end. However, once they put that tank in and they put fuel in it, that tank weighs a lot. And the tank is going to start settling into the backfill material that's on the outside. And when it settles, it's most common for it to settle with a little bit of trim on the turbine end. How the accumulation of water builds up in the tank and affects where you can find it and affects whether you're going to be able to get it out. That's the most important point here. So there's different ways that tanks can settle, and there's terminology that they use to describe it. There's one that we already said, trim by the fill end. The fill end is the lowest point. The water has built up and moved down to the fill end. You can get it out. It's easiest to remove there. But the opposite, trim by the turbine end, it's a lot more difficult to get that water out because you don't really have access to it. There's also tanks that settle in a kind of a sagging pattern or a hogging pattern, where the center of the tank could be lower than both of the ends or vice versa, and that's going to affect that what that's going to do is essentially changes the shape of the tank, causes water to build up in certain defined ways. There's even, if you want to get even more complicated, tanks have these bottom plates, and they're inside of the tank. They kind of reinforce the bottom. And when you get, a lot of fuel that's in there, the fuel, you have 10,000 gallons of fuel. Well, a gallon of diesel weighs like 8-something pounds. So if you have 10,000 gallons, that's like 40 tons of fuel pressing down on those plates. And it is not uncommon for those tank bottom plates to deform over time. And when they deform, their shape changes, of course. That's the nature of deformity. And what that does is it actually creates pockets and spaces for water to then collect and pool. And how are you going to know if that's the case? If you're a technician, how are you going to know that? Short of, busting the tank open and diving in there, which, of course, not going to do. You don't know that. So how do you know where all this water is and how to get to it? The best that you can say is that it's in there and it's probably in there, but you can't get to it yourself to pull it out. So all of this speaks to the truth. The truth that influences something as simple as detecting water. There's a lot of variance between what's appearing in our samples and what's actually going on in the storage tank. And if it's true, this kind of stuff's true for something as simple as water, then it can be just as easily be as true, if not more, for the concept of microbes. So, talking about sampling, we should all be pretty much on board with this idea that good sampling helps determine whether we're going to see what we need to see or not. So without a good sample, it is impossible to know if your test results that you're going to do with those on those samples, it's impossible to know if your foregoing test results actually reflect the reality of the situation. So good samples are important. But who defines a good sample? And who tells us how we can go about getting a good sample? So this is where we start talking about these methodologies here. Condition monitoring and sampling methodologies. Now, The gold standard for sampling practices are the ASTM standards. And there are two standards that are most applicable for us. You see them there on your screen. There's D4057, which is the official title for that is the Standard Practice for Manual Sampling of Petroleum Products. And this standard covers how to best collect fuel samples if you want to do some kind of specification testing, like if you want to verify the fuel quality or some of its physical characteristics. The problem, though, and this is important to realize, the problem, though, is that D4057 does not cover or take into account the special issues that need to be considered if you want to test for microbes and microbiological tests. And so that is why they had to create a different standard. They created D7464. 7464 is the set of recommendations, the set of, the standard practice for sampling that's intended to be used to do microbiological testing and determination. So those are the two ASTM standard practices, so to speak, that cover how you should sample petroleum liquid fuel. Now, we said a while ago, we said that microbes most like to live on solid surfaces where there's biofilms. And so there stands to reason that if you really wanted to get the best sample you possibly could, you would do surface sampling of storage tanks. Like you would get tank coupons, or you would bust the tank open. You would go down in there and you would get biofilm samples from everywhere in the tank. You saw it, et cetera, et cetera. But we know in reality, you're not going to do that. You can't do that. You're not going to have access. You're not going to have the ability to do that kind of thing. It's just not, I've got in my notes, it's rarely practical to get a surface sample. No kidding. Yeah, you're not going to be able to get surface samples like that out in the real world, which means the best alternative is to get bottom samples, bottom liquid fuel and water samples. Because sludge and sediment, microbial biofilm, those tend to settle to the tank bottoms, and they also tend, if you've got not just a tank, but let's say a pipeline, they tend to settle, if you've got a pipe, they tend to settle to the bottom dead center of the pipe. So if you're ultimately trying to find microbes, ideally, best practice, best case, you want a three-phase sample. Three-phase sample being water phase or bottom water, rag layer, which is that microbial biofilm that's at the interface between fuel and water, and what we call near bottom fuel, which is fuel that's about 10 to 16 inches above the water phase. Now, how can you get a sample that's got like near bottom fuel? Well, what that means is that you're going to have to check for water in your tank beforehand, see how high it is. Is it a 3-inch? Is it a 2-inch size phase? So you're going to have to use water paste and a stick or sounding tape, find the depth, and then account for your height, and then you should be able to know how deep you need to have your sampler in order to get fuel from that 10 to 16 inches or so. Now, another consideration here, and this is one that speaks to testing protocols. You want, when you're taking fuel samples, you want to make sure you sterilize your sampling tools, because if you don't, it is very easy to cross-contaminate samples and skew your results, and you will not know what's actually going on. Now, the old school method, if you ask the fuel microbiologist, the old school method would be, well, you dip the tools in alcohol, even like ethanol, and you flame them, and that sterilizes them. And yes, that absolutely does sterilize them. But flaming tools like that out in the field, not something you're really going to be able to have as an option if you're around fuel. So out in the field, practically for when we're going to be doing this stuff, the best practice to sterilize these fuels, prevent cross-contamination, is you take the sample, you put it in an unused bottle, then you take your bacon bomb or your fuel sampler and you rinse it in alcohol before you collect the next sample. And that alcohol needs to be at least 70% alcohol by volume. And if you use other equipment like, let's say, a funnel to transfer the fluids, you need to make sure that that's sterilized as well. So those are the kinds of things that go into good sampling. And good sampling is absolutely critical to getting as accurate a picture of the realities of what's going on in the storage tank as possible. We said at the beginning, we have a psychological tendency to believe that what we see is the way reality is. What we see is all there is. And that means that we, again, psychologically, we want to believe that our samples, whatever we pull, that they're representative. But if we have bad sampling techniques, we can be fooled into thinking that our samples are accurate when they're really, when they're really not, basically. Now, we talked about how to handle your equipment, how to sterilize your equipment, where you need to take a sample from. But there's more that there's more that goes into condition monitoring and good sampling. There's more that goes into that than just, did I pull my sample from the right place and have I avoided cross-contamination? No, there's other considerations that we need to take into account, like how often should I sample? I mean, we do sampling so that we can test that and we can get test data. And we are hoping, or we're intending, that test data is going to tell us something meaningful about what we've got. But test data from samples doesn't mean anything if we don't have the proper context to give it meaning. You have to be able to interpret it properly in order to give it proper meaning, so to speak. And so, when we do an ATP test on a given sample, and we get a number that's supposed to indicate microbial units, number of microbes that's in a milliliter of it. And so we'll get a number and we'll say, okay, the guidelines for interpretation here say that if you've got more than 10,000 microbial equivalents, that's basically the fancy way of saying microbes. If you've got more than 10,000 microbes per milliliter in this fuel, you have a problem. Or the exact words would be, typically indicates a problem. But the operative word there is typically, because when you get down to it, every tank environment is different. Every tank in every place across the fruited plain has what we would say has its own fingerprint. That basically means that 10,000 microbial equivalents in this tank over here may not necessarily be as much of a problem as 10,000 over here. It depends on a lot of different things. Now, we use 10,000 as this benchmark because we like to think that it's applicable to the most number of things, and you do have to have a starting point somewhere. But really, ultimately, the best goal that we and others in our position should be shooting for is to actually figure out what our tank and what our system's fingerprints are. But how do you do that? Well, bottom line is that you do it by testing and generating data and developing a picture of what's going on. Now, to break that down into a little bit more usable chunks, well, we would start by getting a good baseline, and then we would do trending, microbial trending over time to see how that baseline changes relative to time and whatever other conditions or parameters we wanted to use. So you start with a baseline. The baseline is going to tell us what the microbial environment in our tank is like to start with. Now, ideally, the best time to establish a baseline would be after the system has been actually professionally cleaned, when it's as clean as it could be. Or you might even try to get it at if you're able to, at when the system is newly constructed and when it just goes into commission. You establish a microbial baseline at that time. Now, you may be hearing that. You may say, well, you're just getting it when the tank's clean. What's that going to tell us? I mean, is that going to tell us anything meaningful? Well, you have to remember, though, that no matter how clean you think something is, there are still zillions, that's a technical term, zillions of microbes in there, because microbes are everywhere. So you're still going to be able to get a meaningful baseline, no matter how clean and microbe-free you think your particular tank is starting from. So you get the baseline, and then you switch to this trending thing. Trending is really the only way to get the right fingerprint for your specific tank. And trending requires just taking multiple samples over a period of time and seeing what the microbe levels are. I mean, it's as simple as that. Now, how often do you have to do it? That's a fair question. You do not have to sample every day. I mean, absolutely not. You do not have to sample every day. The best practice, most common thing that a microbiologist would recommend is that you sample 3 times during your control interval. Okay, control interval. We're throwing another term into it. What's a control interval? Well, the control interval for your particular system is the length of time that your tank takes to develop problematic levels of microbial growth. So as you do your trending over time and you get more data points, you start to be better able to see how the microbial levels in your specific tank, remember, to see how those microbial levels rise and fall relative to different points in time. And you start to see trends develop that show you at what points in time your microbe levels tend to rise above your cutoff for action, your cutoff to do something about them. And as you develop these trends, you start to see that those points in time, the points in time where your microbe levels have risen above your cutoff for action, that's your control interval. And so the recommendation is that once you know what your control interval is for your specific tank or system, then you can plan to sample 3 times for each control interval period. Now, again, we've said, we're trying to develop a fingerprint because we know that every tank and every system is different. But if we're going for generalizations here, when we're asking the question, how, what's a long control interval versus a short control interval? What's a common control interval? The general idea is a common control interval for a bulk storage tank is between 6 and 12 months. That means, the absence of evidence to the contrary, you would want to be trending and sampling and getting data points every 2 to 3 months at least. But really, the bottom line takeaway here is that you need to get enough data to figure out what your tank system's true control interval should be. Okay, so that's trending and control intervals. We are moving right along here. Let's talk briefly about this thing called chain of custody, because it is important from a Bell FTS standpoint and how we are supposed to be doing things. It is important to talk about. Now, it is always best practice to have a chain of custody, or what they call COC documentation. It's always best practice to have chain of custody documentation on file whenever samples are collected that are going to be tested at a later date and time, or later time and place. Now, a chain of custody form, a typical chain of custody form, will give you enough information to document who had the sample at what point in time, what is intended to be done with the sample, and who did the work or who is going to do the work. Bottom line, every good lab uses chain of custody forms because they are important. They can even be important legally as well. They can be legal documents. So acknowledging, if we accept that all of this is true, acknowledging the importance of the chain of custody form starts with, it really starts to imply to us or confirm to us the importance of sample handling. So let's talk about that a little bit. Now, since microbes are living organisms, when you take samples, when you sample them, and you're going to take those living organisms, you're going to take them out of what's been considered to be their normal environment, because they grew up in that tank. That's what they know. They know that tank environment. They have adjusted their life cycles. They've adjusted so that they can live and grow based on what they find in there. Now you're going to sample them. You're going to take some of those microbes out of that living environment. Well, they can, not all of them are entirely tolerant to that kind of thing. They can react adversely, and they can react, and this is most important, they can react in ways that weaken the relationship between your test results and the state of the measured parameters in the system from which you pulled sample. That's a very fancy way of basically saying that if you pull a sample, there's a chance that it may not stay being the best representation of what things are actually like in that tank from which they came from. Now, typically, you can have 3 different kinds of scenarios related to that. Now, so what we mean here is you got a storage tank. You pull a fuel sample that's got microbial presence in it, and you intend to test that microbial presence, and you intend to infer or use those results to tell you to help you to see what's actually going on inside of that. So you do that. Now, once you do that, you can have 3 scenarios that go on. Now, the first one is the one that we hope is going to be. The microbial population doesn't actually change. It stays the same. And so what you test is, for the most part, what is actually present in that tank environment. If that's what you have, then that's the best news that you could have. However, it doesn't always end up being that way. Second scenario could be that over the time, in the time between when you pulled the sample and when you're getting around to testing it, the microbes actually multiply and grow and actually increase in number. Now, we test that we're going to get that there's 10,000 microbial equivalents, when in fact maybe when we pulled it out there were actually 4,000. Well, that's not ideal. That's a false positive. It's not ideal, but at least, the silver lining is that at least we're going to be able to see qualitatively that there is microbial presence in there. That's one thing you can say for sure. You may not be able to say, yeah, we got 10,000 microbes, but you can say for sure, yes, we have microbes in there from enough microbes to be meaningful type of thing. The third scenario is the one that we don't really like. The third scenario is that the microbes don't like being in that sample and they actually die off, either in part or in whole. And what this does, when you test that sample, you get a false test reading, a false negative. You record there's no microbes in there when in fact there's probably zillions of microbes in that tank. The problem is that they all died off. Now, the longer the amount of time that passes between sample collection and testing, the weaker the relationship is. That is a hard and fast rule. You can take that to the bank. So, what's the ideal time frame? Well, we can talk about ideal time frames, and then we can talk about ones that are feasible in the real world. The ideal time frame if you could have your way, ideally 4 hours. The ideal situation would be you pull the sample and you can test it within 4 hours of it being pulled. That will give you the greatest chance of having results that actually match what is true in that tank. But in the real world, more than 80% of the samples that are sent to labs and that fuel microbiologists have to work with, more than 80% are not just more than 4 hours old, they're more than 24 hours old. But yet, if that's what you got, that's what you got, right? So you always have to take or account for the possibility of margin of error. You always have to take that into account when you interpret what you find with respect to measured microbial presence. And so a final note on this. The best practices for detecting microbial contamination are from, as we said, from system surfaces that have biofilm that are located at or in the vicinity of the fuel-water interface. But again, this is a pretty specific directive. It's really hard for most people to get surface samples from that specific area. The next best place to get viable samples would be bottom samples that contain near bottom fuel, they contain bottom water, and they contain some element of the sludge and sediment that is commonly referred to as the rag layer. Now, again, remember we said dispenser samples aren't going to be useful because they don't really show microbial presence. The reason that is because dispenser samples tend to filter out the water and they tend to filter out the rag layer. Now, if you can get a dispenser sample where microbial presence shows up, then what you can take to the bank there is that the system is really, really bad because the system really has to be tremendously overwhelmed with microbial growth for it to be able to show up in a dispenser sample. So